After I posted the first part of this series, someone made the comment that the pattern bit that I was showing is actually called a flush trim bit. And I looked it up and he was right. I don't claim to know everything, so I make these kind of mistakes. I was long under the assumption that pattern bit and flush trim bit were interchangeable terms for a bit with a bearing that trims items flush around the template. And from there you would differentiate between whether you wanted the bearing at the end of the cutter like it is here, or whether you wanted the bearing towards the shank, depending on whether you want the template to be face up or face down on your router table. Now the semantics of this situation are unfortunate because as far as I can tell, there is no umbrella term for a bit that duplicates a template. In fact, even the term template bit is just another term for a pattern bit, which is specifically the bit with the bearing at the shank. So anyway, the point of me telling you all this is just to say that the original name of this series was Pattern Bit Solutions, which, rather than renaming it Flush Trim Bit and Pattern Bit Solutions, which I find to be very unwieldy and not very inviting, rather I'm going to name it Template Duplication Solutions, or Template Duplicating Solutions. Whatever it says at the top of this video, that's what I name it. Which, that name is still not very inviting, but at least it accurately describes what we're talking about, duplicating templates. So with all that said, this is a good opportunity to talk about the different router bit options and what the pros and cons are of choosing one option over the other. Now for guitar work, for the most part, we're talking about using router bits in a router table like you see here, rather than in a handheld router like this plunge router, or like this laminate trim router right here. General woodworkers, furniture makers, because they're working on larger pieces, they tend to use the handheld routers a lot more. For guitar work, we tend to be using a lot smaller pieces where we're cutting patterns on a bridge or the end of a fretboard tongue or something like that. So the router table is a much safer and more optimal setup for the kind of work that we do as luthiers. So that's what we're going to focus on. So for template duplicating work on a router table, you're really going to want to use a flush trim bit and not a pattern bit. Again, the difference being the flush trim bit has the bearing on top, the pattern bit has the bearing on the bottom. That way you can have your template on top. For example, here I'm just using this fretboard template here. You can have your template on top and your workpiece on the bottom. That way you can always see the pattern that you're trying to cut because it's on top. If you were using a pattern bit, again, that's the one with the bearing on the bottom, then your template would have to be on the bottom. And your workpiece, whatever overhang that you're trying to remove on that workpiece, would completely shroud your view of the template itself, which just makes it a lot more difficult to do this safely. In fact, the only case, in my opinion, to opt for a pattern bit on a router table would be to deal with alternating grain directions on a single piece. And we'll talk more about alternating grain directions in a later episode, but I could totally see on a very curvy pattern using a flush trim bit with the template on top for most of the piece, but then for the sections where the bit would be biting into the grain, instead of having to reverse direction and do climb cuts, you could remove the template and place it on the bottom of the workpiece and then run the difficult sections through on the router table with the pattern bit instead. That way you could always be feeding the workpiece against the rotation of the bit, and at the same time you would never have the bit biting into the grain. The only problem that I really see with that is having to remove the template and place it back on. There's always the possibility that your positioning might be just a little bit off. It's a challenge, but not something you couldn't overcome, especially if you used pins or something like that to locate the template. Anyway, I don't own any pattern bits, but this is something I've thought about adding to my bit arsenal so I can do what I just talked about. But if anybody has any experience using both the flush trim bit and the pattern bit together in this way, Please let me know what you think of it. So I want to show you another option to the straight cut bit, which is the bit that we were using before, and that is the spiral bit. And there's actually, that then breaks down into two types of spiral bits. There's upcut and downcut, but we'll just leave that alone for a second, and let's talk about the difference between the common straight cut bit, which is widely available. You can find them at Lowe's, Home Depot, those type of department stores, whereas this is much more of a specialty item, and for that reason it is a lot more expensive, which is one of its downsides. The upside, and there's numerous upsides, is for one, the spiral bit, as opposed to the straight cut bit, is going to slice that surface at an angle, rather than the straight cut bit, which cuts the entire surface all at once, which clearly is more work for the bit, which generates more tear out. This, you get an extremely smooth cut. Another thing it does is it stays in, as it spins, it's going to stay in constant contact with the workpiece, which eliminates, or reduces, I should say, chatter. This bit, however, it has 3 separate straight edges, and each one of those edges basically smacks into the wood, one after the other, into the full width of the piece of wood that you're presenting to it, which creates a lot of chatter. It also tends to sort of push the workpiece in a subtle way away from the bit. Makes it a little harder to work with. This, because it stays in constant contact, actually creates this effect where it kind of pulls the workpiece and the bit together and holds them together. Now, the difference between a spiral upcut bit and a spiral downcut bit is always a little bit confusing to understand or remember the difference between them, because depending on how you're holding the router, whether it's in a router table like it is like it is here, or whether it's in a handheld router, well, your definition of up and down are going to be different in either of those two cases. But the easy way to think about it is an upcut bit is evacuating the debris up towards the base of the router. Whether it's in the table or you're holding it in your hand, it doesn't matter. It's pulling it towards the base. A downcut is away from the base. So in this case, for patterns, for pattern routing, I would recommend the upcut, because the upcut is what's going to pull the workpiece and the bit together like I was describing. So what are the downsides of this bit? Number one, as I alluded to before, I paid over $80 for this bit, the spiral bit. But then the other downside to spiral bits is that it actually can't handle as deep of a cut as the straight bit can. So what I mean is I can have more overhang on my workpiece coming out from underneath the template with the straight cut bit than I can allow for this. This will actually bog down and kick the piece away if I try to present too much wood to it. This, however, won't. It's still not a good idea to present, have either bit have to chew through a lot of wood. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about next, which is one of the most important things here, which is trimming the overhang. So all the wood that hangs out from your template down as close as you can to the template.